Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. Comedians use their genius to give us joy, laughter, and even to help us think about things differently. And yet those same people who bring us so much pleasure are often people who experience deep levels of depression, anxiety, and histories of trauma. I've taken great interest in the way comedians think and their lives. And that is why I'm so happy to have had the opportunity to speak with a psychologist who specializes in working with comedians. Dr. Ildiko Tabori is a psychologist in Los Angeles who has many specialties, including serving as the resident psychologist for the Laugh Factory, a top-tier comedy club in LA. She has worked with comedians there since 2011 and has been interviewed by the media about her work, and I loved learning with her. If you're a comedy fan or know someone who is, listen in and definitely share this episode. Dr. Ildiko Tabori, a hearty welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So happy.
Super
Right on, as well you should be. Well, here is the deal, folks. I saw Ildiko on TV, actually. She was being interviewed during, I believe, a Chris Farley documentary. It was called The Dark Side of Comedy. It was on Hulu through Vice. And oh my goodness, you really delivered some important content. And you're speaking to something that we all kind of know about a little bit, but you know about really well. And that is that the bringers of levity, humor, healing, actually, and I call them kind of walking philosophers who normalize things that we might not really think about because they're so forthcoming, they're so vulnerable, they're so courageous, getting up there at the peril of possibly bombing and having tomatoes thrown at them to try to bring us happiness, which is like, when you think about the kindest thing a human can do for another human, the comedians are doing some pretty kind things.
Oh, they're heroes. Absolutely. Heroes in general are heroes. We forget about the arts when we talk about healthcare, because oftentimes that you want to be funny. When I was going through chemo earlier this year, I was thinking like, you know what, comedians should be reading me the directions on what I need to do, because it made the situation, which is already a heavy situation, so much more light.
So I hadn't planned on starting there, but a few weeks ago, I interviewed this is a perfect spot to talk about for us, Ildiko. A few weeks ago, I interviewed a pediatric oncology nurse who is the Patch Adams of healthcare. He is one of the funniest human beings I've ever known. And he knows how to titrate and modulate his humor so that it's just the right amount and just the right time. And you're talking about something as a cancer survivor, as you can speak firsthand about the healing effects of humor. Let's actually start there. I was planning on starting about your backstory, but let's talk about what have you experienced regarding the healing powers of humor? And
oh my God. I mean, up until the beginning of this year, I had no major medical issues. I had aches and pains, but that was because I grew up a gymnast. So, and age with that. And so now all of a sudden I'm the patient and I had to do the things that I needed to really take care of me. Now, my cancer was caught early. It was caught accidentally, which is why it was caught early. And so I made it through, I wouldn't say seamlessly, I had a couple meltdowns. And by couple, I mean 2. I was able to count them. And I got myself through watching comedy on YouTube. And I love Lucy, of course, one of the greatest comedians ever. And so, yeah, it was a lot. I just need to keep my spirits up because you're just kind of in survival mode during that. A lot of changes, not just poison being put in your body, but like the physical changes that I went through. I had no eyebrows or eyelashes.
It sounds like it gave you a temporary reprieve from the heaviness of all of the change and so much that was outside your control. You could control what you watched, and you could actually, almost like a morphine drip without the morphine, you could hit the funny button and allow yourself to feel some relief.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Or think about these funny things that I had heard or listened to or read. So that made an already difficult process a little bit easier.
You know, I was speaking with Mark about this, and I'll share it again, because when I was 10 years old, I broke my jaw in 3 places. And I know it's definitely not comparing my experience to yours, but I remember at 10, I don't know what angel was looking at me, but ordinarily, the story goes, my mother would provide me with very healthy lunches, i.e., not super delicious, but very healthful. In retrospect, they were always the right choices, but they were not the delicious choices. And I certainly had nothing to trade my fellow students with. But the day I broke my jaw, I had a roast beef sandwich and it was delicious. And when I got to the hospital, the first thing I did was I promptly puked. And I looked at the nurse and I thought I could cry right now, or I could, here's what I'll say. And here's what I heard myself say. I said, oh my God. And that was such a delicious lunch. After I puked. And I was like only 10 years old. And I was like, and I decided to make it funny moving forward, the whole thing. And I do believe that it participated in what was considered clinically a very fast healing process of my jaw. Let's get into, though, how did you get into helping? Blown away by the Laugh Factory and Jamie Masada and his genius for recognizing that comedians do need some help from time to time. And I'm wondering, how did you get this awesome job of being a mental health practitioner who provides psychotherapy to comedians?
There was really no magic in it. Somebody recommended me, and that was it. And I met with Jamie, and we went from there. I know he met with other people. I don't know what that was about. I obviously wasn't privy to that, but it was just as simple as that. It was just easy and manageable. And I don't know why he chose me. Maybe because I told him I was a fan of Johnny Carson since I was 11 years old. I've since named my dog Johnny Carson.
That's
dog
so awesome.
Comedy, but I had a different dog before. But my current dog is Johnny Carson.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I figured I can't name my kid Johnny Carson, but I can name the dog. Name the cat Eartha Kitty. So I have my own fun.
What's amazing about that is, how unusual for an 11-year-old girl growing up in Los Angeles you could have gravitated towards, during that era, a host of other comedic people, but you went to a man who's considered to be, by all talk show hosts, the standard. And you understood at 11, like, this guy is funny somehow. So you've had a tether to comedy since a young age.
Yeah. Then I remember listening to comedy albums on vinyl, some old stuff.
For sure.
And then some newer stuff. I remember listening to Stephen Wright. That's one of the first comedy albums I was listening to. And then we didn't have YouTube back then. I think we had cassettes, but we didn't have CDs and
streaming, for sure.
Streaming services now, right?
Right. So, I think about Stephen Wright and what a philosopher he is. And I think about all comedians in general as being at higher risk probably than most for depression, anxiety, possibly having traumatic pasts, and trying to create the funny out of the detritus of those experiences. I was wondering if you could speak to what you've observed. Why do you think comedians have suffered so much, and how might they have stumbled on comedy as a thing for coping?
That's actually a really, really good question, and one that hasn't been asked. So I am really thankful for that one. And if you think about it, humor is a defense mechanism. And it's one of the most sophisticated defense mechanisms. So I'm thinking, okay, well, it might have been a defense mechanism. It's a sophisticated one. I truly, truly, truly believe that comedians have higher IQs than general population.
Oh, for sure.
There's no research out there on that. And I think that would be a fantastic dissertation project for a doctoral student. But, give a bunch of IQ tests to comedians and see what pops up. And I'm waiting for a doctoral student to approach me on that one, but that would be my best guess. That was their way, sophisticated, they're smart, and that was the way that they gravitated into managing difficult emotions, difficult experiences, traumas in their lives, like we all do, but this is how they went. Some people will go to writing, some people will go to art, some people will go to acting, but the specific part of performance.
I'm thinking as you're talking and beginning to connect something we said before the recorded interview, and that is that comedians, in addition to what you just said, and I agree wholeheartedly, they are way smarter than the average bear by one or two standard deviations, perhaps even more. So possibly some of the smartest people in the room. Conan O'Brien is one great example of just extreme intelligence. Like, he always makes the best choices comedically and intellectually as he's doing this. But one of the misnomers, or perhaps a bad piece of PR, as far as I'm concerned, around comedians is that they're silly and not to be taken seriously in a way. And when we think about the list of best actors, as we were talking about, and actresses, it's rarely for a comedic part and rarely to a comedian. And as I've heard many directors in film during interviews bemoan the fact that you can make a funny person serious quite easily, but it's really hard to make a serious person funny. I would think that part of what leads to the mental health issues of the comedian is that they're not taken seriously, that they are told to be sometimes like Jon Stewart was many years ago, to be a monkey on a show. And Jon basically looked at the guy and said, "I'm not your monkey." And I loved that moment. That was one of my all-time favorite moments. And yeah, I wonder, just since we are such social creatures and the feedback loop is so often kind of not taking the comedian seriously, I wonder just that they might not take themselves seriously and that they might kind of bash themselves. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no. They do take themselves seriously. I think the person that gets on the stage, in my experience, it's a persona. It's not resembles them, but it's a persona of who they are, an extension of who they are. There have been many a time that I've walked into the Laugh Factory in the evening to see a patient and there's a show going on and I go through the back and go upstairs and I kind of tune into what's on stage, but not really. I'm not really paying attention because I'm on a mission, because I'm in work mode. But I'm hearing what's on stage and the story sounds really familiar. And then I look and see who's on the stage. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a patient of mine. I know the real story behind it. And so whatever that story is put out, it's that kind of therapeutic process. It's that kind of making sense of this bad experience that happened. Oh, look, this bad thing happened. I'm going through a divorce. Let's just say I'm going through a divorce. And that's a trying time for anybody who's been through it. And then on stage making fun of this divorce, and they're picking out the experiences that are familiar to everybody who's gone through that. And they're making light of it as kind of taking ownership of their experience.
That makes total sense. And I also wonder if there's something about wearing a persona, having the burden of being kind of stretching yourself in that moment. By the way, persona, folks, means kind of the public mask that you wear rather than your authentic self all the time. And I find myself thinking about what you're saying, that there might be a gap between who they really are and how they have to present themselves as being. And that might also add to the mix and perhaps the burden that they carry. I wonder if that rings true for you too.
I mean, yeah, there's a heaviness that can come with it. Let's go back to what started Jamie's idea of bringing in a psychologist to the Laugh Factory was his experience with Greg Giraldo. And he had died 2 or 3 months maybe before I met with Jamie for the first time. If you go back and look at, he died of an overdose. I don't know if it was intentional or not. But if you go back and look at Greg Giraldo's career, and I'm taking this off of the documentary I saw.
Sure.
He starts off light and fun and interesting. And this was a smart man. He was an attorney. He went to Harvard with Obama. He was in Obama's class, right? So he was a very, very smart man and decided, I don't want to be an attorney. I did it. I made my parents proud, my immigrant parents proud. But now I just don't want to do it anymore. So I'm going to go into comedy. And he did. He was quite successful. And then whatever happened in his life, he started down the substance abuse path as his coping tool, and which ultimately led to his death. But if you look at his comedy prior to his death, it got very angry and very confrontational and dark, where in the beginning it was much lighter. And so there is that kind of progression that happens. And I think going back to what we were just talking about initially with Chris Farley, I mean, there was a lot of deep darkness underneath, insecurity. He's this big dude and there's a lot of fat shaming going on. And then he could only be funny if he was fat.
When fat guy falls down, people laugh.
Right. Yeah. What was it? If Fatty Falls? Yeah.
If Fatty Falls. That's it. There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, God. It tore my heart out because Chris gave me so much joy. And just to see the turmoil that was his life. And it sounds like in addition to comedy itself being a coping strategy, when things are spinning badly, substance abuse and other addictions kind of come into the mix. I was wondering, like, it seems that comedians have maybe, I don't know if there's been any studies on this, have a greater chance of dying than perhaps the general population. Is that?
Yeah, I don't know. That one I don't know about. But I do know that there's a comedian that dies every year. Like
a youngish comedian who dies every year.
Not necessarily young. I mean, Robin Williams was not young. I mean,
let's substitute the term young for before would have been their organic time.
Correct. And, was either by suicide or by an overdose, whether accidental or not. Knowing what we know now about Robin Williams, I mean, he had Lewy bodies.
Right.
So that was not going to be pleasant. And he probably had it because Lewy body, my background actually is as a neuropsychologist. Lewy bodies hits you in your fifth decade of life. So that's kind of around the onset of it, fifth or sixth decade. So you're sitting at your 40s and 50s.
Yeah, and it was a very misunderstood.
Yeah.
Right. And I believe hearing about Cindy Williams, who played Mindy in Mork and Mindy, who got to join up with, I think it was she, who got to join up with Robin Williams. And she said, yeah, he was a different guy after the Lewy bodies dementia. It was just not the same Robin that she'd known. And I would imagine that relying on one's intellect and wit to have that kind of assault on his brain must have been overly traumatic.
Yeah. Because, I mean, when you're talking about the intelligence factor, when it comes with comedian, and he was up there in terms of talent and intelligence, and he could just go this way and that way and this way and that way. And he was dealing with other mental health issues. He had a history of depression. I don't know for certain if he had bipolar disorder. I've heard that. I don't know if it's true or not. But he definitely had that manic, hypomanic energy. And it's, and that's like chain yourself.
Yeah, it's so utterly tragic, and so leaves us with a last taste of this great human being who provided so much goodness. You could kind of describe, I don't know if this is even possible, because there's no such thing as a typical session or a typical client, but even with the general population. But how might your experiences with comedians be somewhat divergent from working with people who are not comedians? What might show up in the context of
I think it's really understanding the comedy culture and the culture of their performance, which I had to learn very quickly. They taught me, and one of the things I learned very early on in my career was listen to your patients. They will teach you. And I started my career in the LA County Jail. So that wasn't something I grew up with. And I didn't know much about drugs or stings or anything like that. And they taught me, the inmates taught me. And so I kind of took that same approach, not that I'm comparing inmates and comedians at all, but essentially it was my ethnographic study of a culture or subculture. So one of the things I started to work on with the comedians, they're like, oh yeah, I'm out socializing every night. I'm like, no, you're not. You're out working every night. And they're like, yeah, but I'm out in a comedy club. And I'm like, yeah, but your comedy club is your cubicle. This is your cubicle. And when we were talking a lot about work-life balance, they thought their life balance was balanced when it really wasn't, because they're thinking that they're out in the comedy club every night. Yeah, you are, but you're there doing business.
My jaw dropped.
Yeah.
That one. Ildiko, that is such a great catch on your part. And what would you encourage them to do in addition to their cubicle that appeared to be social?
Yeah, really do the cognitive restructuring of this is your cubicle. So you have to do other things. These are your work hours. Yes, your work hours just happen to be in the evening inside of the comedy club, but those are still your work hours. So you still have to do all the other things in life and have that work-life balance. You need to exercise. You need the nutrition. You also need to have fun with your friends outside of the comedy club. You need to do the other things that feed your soul. I mean, the same could be said for you and I. We talk for a living, but it's different when we're out with our friends at a dinner party or at a restaurant talking. That's very different. Yeah, I talk. This isn't social time, right? When you're with
you and I would be invited to approximately 0 dinner parties if we were talking like therapists during our meals.
Except when you're asked, what do you think?
Oh boy. So let's go back to, it's funny, it's almost as if you intuited some of my questions. I too am a big proponent of the idea that we learn from our patients or clients, or as I call them, the people who come to see me. And it's my job to really, really learn their world. Similar to you, I jumped into the profession, and it's appropriate to say jumped in because I was working with gang affiliated youth. And they taught me they really let them know straight up that, hey, I'm learning from you about your world and what your life is like, because if I don't, I cannot really, really treat you. What have comedians taught you about psychotherapy in general and perhaps life, if that's not too big of a question? What have you learned? What have been some of your gleanings from these great people?
One of the things that I have experienced is, other than, yes, you need to have a work-life balance, and sometimes we don't even follow our own advice.
No.
On it. But really just how difficult this creative process is. It is a business and it is a really hard approach in life. And it's scary to get in touch with these uncomfortable feelings that you're going to put out there. We'll go back to the divorce experience. You're going to talk about it on stage. Well, again, it's really getting to a place where you can have some understanding and take some ownership over your painful feelings. And sometimes it's really difficult to go there. I can't talk about that just yet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard. I hadn't done anything creative since I was an undergrad. I fancy myself a writer. And I went off to grad school, wrote my dissertation. That was unpleasant, as you know. And that's not a creative process. I mean,
Nope.
I decided I needed to paint my kitchen cabinets like twice while I was writing my dissertation. So now, 30 years later and cancer, I'm taking a writing workshop class and I forgot how hard creativity is. And so it makes me go back to these communities and they're writing their jokes and they're performing and they're doing the business aspect of what you see on stage, which just looks easy. And there's a lot in there. There's a lot of processing that has to happen before you see it on that stage.
I was telling you off record that I did a tight 3 minutes once just to see what it would be like. People say, "Oh, Adam, you're funny." Well, being intentionally funny is so different than being kind of situationally and unintentionally funny. What they're doing is the hardest thing in the world. And just folks, just to let you know, I faced crickets. And in fact, one of the pieces of feedback I got was, "Hey, you know what you should do next time is be funny." And I'd somehow forgotten that. And it's really, really hard. So we're talking about, and every comedian has bombed, which we know has to, no matter how bomb-proof these comedians may be or become, it's gotta hurt to bomb because we know that rejection hits the same pain centers as physical pain. So these brave folks are kind of going into fiery buildings, in a manner of speaking, getting all kinds of heat and things falling on them, so to speak, metaphorically. And I imagine have to toughen up on some level. And that may be a strength and that may be a weakness. Can you describe how their toughness may be that sometimes empowering and sometimes disempowering to the comedian?
I can say the empowering part of the toughness is that understanding of, let's say they're up on stage and they're bombing, and the ones who are skilled, these are not new comedians, the ones who are skilled will go, okay, yeah, I just didn't connect to the audience. This joke doesn't work. I've been trying to work this joke for a while and I just need to toss it because this isn't working. So they understand that process. Had experiences where I've seen one comedian do the same set 2 nights in a row, obviously different audiences except for me. And like one night wasn't happening for me. And then the next night, this guy was hilarious. And it was the exact same set. And it was just a different, I don't know if it was me. I don't know if it was the audience. It was just, his performance was spot on. And this was a skilled comedian, a very, very good one. And one that I'm definitely a big fan of, but it was just a different day. Who knows? I mean, maybe it was a full moon. And now it wasn't a full moon. Who knows? So in terms of that empowering part, that's spot on. When it's can be detrimental, I think, when that toughness can make you kind of hard sometimes. And then you forget to have empathy and sensitivity. So you have to kind of continue to work on staying in touch with yourself and being okay with who you are.
Really nicely put. And just to speak to one of the things that you just said, and that is that same comedian, same jokes, 2 nights in a row, 2 vastly different outcomes. There's so many things that fall outside the comedian's control, including the people to whom the comedian's speaking. So I'm just really taken by that. One of the things that is also covered on the series that you're a part of is Andrew Dice Clay, who apparently, according at least to the documentary, was not that Andrew Dice Clay we've come to know. It was actually his persona, as you were saying. And I find myself wondering, being that persona night after night after night, I imagine it's very hard for the comedian at some point, after clocking that many hours in that persona, to differentiate him or herself from the persona itself. Have you had any experience trying to help people find a way to compartmentalize who they actually are if they have a persona that might be different from the persona on stage?
Yeah, actually, that hasn't been a huge issue. And by the way, Andrew Dice Clay is another one of those who could do drama.
Right. Yeah, he did Bodyguard, didn't he? And a few others.
He did. He was
Not Bodyguard. I did Stars Born, sorry.
Yes. And he did
A Woody Allen film.
Jasmine.
Yeah.
I just recently saw him in Pam and Tommy. I think he was in Pam and Tommy.
No way. He was in that.
Yeah, he was like a mafia guy. And like didn't even recognize him. But I was watching it with a friend of mine and I just was like, oh yeah, that's Andrew Dice Clay. I'm like, seriously? Didn't even look like him. So yeah, I mean, he's another one who can do that. He's just transitioned and he's not that rough, macho dude.
Misogynistic, homophobic guy who he portrayed himself to be in the 90s, which was actually very damaging in some ways to probably himself, but certainly to society as well.
But people loved him.
People loved him.
People loved that persona. Now I completely forgot.
So in terms of the whole idea of marinating in that persona, do you ever have to separate or help the people?
Yeah, no, I think that those personas, they don't just like start one day. I mean, it's one of those, it's that creativity process. It's them workshopping, whatever it is. It's them going to, open nights or smaller venues to work things out before they get to bigger venues. I've seen comedians who will do late night spots in the middle of the week, the Laugh Factory, who are very well known and will these drop-ins and just to work some jokes out, or they take them either on the road or they take them on a Friday, Saturday night.
So. The kind of workshopping, and that's so cool.
And that's how you do it.
That's how you do it. I love that. Without mentioning any names, have you met people who you expected to be a particular way because of you loved their work and found out, wow, this person is actually spectacularly different from the way they present?
So yes, I never had expectations on who I would meet. I'm an LA kid, so we grow up around Hollywood and the entertainment business. So we see celebrities at the grocery store. So it's never been an issue. I've been starstruck 3 times in my life, 3 times. And one of which happened at the Laugh Factory. And it was shortly after I had started. So when I started trying to be the researcher that I am not, that I was in grad school, I remember speaking with Jamie Masada. I'm like, is there any book or anything I should read before I start working with the comedians? And he told me to read I'm Dying Up Here.
For sure. Great book.
Which is very different than, the book is actually very, very different than
the Showtime show.
Yeah. So I read it and it was really about what was going on at the Comedy Store at the time. And then they were unionizing. So in the 70s, they talked a lot about young Letterman and young Leno, and they chose this comedian named Tom Dreesen to be the union leader, organizer or whatever, because he was super nice and even keeled and gathered people. And it just spoke so beautifully of him in this book. And I'm like, wow, what a nice man. A few months later, I'm volunteering at the Laugh Factory for either Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, which Jamie does each year, feeding everybody for free. And the comedians volunteer their time. And I'm standing there looking, I'm like, oh, and there's a comedian about ready to get on stage. I'm like, who's that really good looking older man over there? And somebody said, oh yeah, that's Tom Dreesen. And I'm like, wait, what?
Oh my God.
I marched right up to him. Hi, and introduced myself. I'm like, I'm the psychologist. He was like, oh, I know who you are. He was the sweetest, nicest man. Still awesome. Is. And every time I see him, he just gives me a big hug. And he is the exact person that I read about in that book.
So wonderful when you read something that lands, when you come to love a person, you find out that person is just like they were on the page.
Yeah.
It's just lovely. Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, I love this man.
Yeah. One thing I neglected to ask you is when you are providing, I used to watch Dr. Katz, and I feel like it showed up on Dr. Katz, the show about a comedian's therapist. It was in the 90s for those, I'm sure you've seen it, those who haven't seen it, John Katz. Great stuff. And even one of the guys from Bob's Burgers, one of the big guys, was the son on the show. Really, really funny show. Anyway, one of the people bemoaned the idea that the comedian needed a therapist who could be a little funny, like always being serious, being serious. So I'm wondering, do you find yourself trying to enter their world and obviously being appropriate, not trying to become a comedian yourself, but you notice anything different when you're trying to be part of their culture and provide them with good therapy, what that looks like?
Yeah, worked with them long enough now. I gotten very nice compliments, which is, hey, you can keep up with us. Now, I think in therapy, it doesn't necessarily need to be all serious and, oh, poor you. We can have some levity in it. And so I find myself saying something funny. They say something funny. I say something funny back. It doesn't take away the work that we're doing in therapy. It doesn't take away from that moment, but it can be a very powerful tool. I remember in grad school, I don't remember exactly where this was. Maybe I was in training. I remember listening to one of the supervisors speak about an experience that he had had with this woman who was really, really angry at her husband. And just for whatever reason was going on, she was super angry, and wasn't making serious threats to kill him, because obviously we have to act upon that, but just like wanted him to disappear, that kind of thing. And she comes in for her next session, and he goes and gets her out of the waiting room, and there's nobody else in the waiting room, just her. And he pokes his head out, getting ready to bring her in. And he goes, "Did you kill him yet?" And it lightened up the mood. And I'm like, that's so fantastic. And this was way back in my training. So I wasn't skilled enough to be able to do that yet. I mean, I felt like I had to sit there and it's like, oh, tell me more, that sort of thing, as opposed to being natural. And I thought that was so genius because it lightened her mood so much.
That's brilliant. And I remember my own training, it was not really trained to be funny with the people I saw. And I remember at some point, I learned that not only did it foster rapport quicker, if I could tune into the humor, and each person has a slightly different humor. And so one type of humor might not work with two different people. You really have to zero in and be judicious and not make it into a funny SNL skit. But I found that it moves the therapy faster. Concepts are better. It's kind of like a spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down at times. So if we become good at judiciously using humor and the appropriate timing and the appropriate dosage and in the appropriate style based on the person we're sitting in front of, it can really accelerate the therapy process.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the more natural you are in the therapy room, I think the easier it is. If you're sitting back and saying the textbook things you're supposed to say to patients, it doesn't really go anywhere. What we learn in school is about being genuine. And so, like, okay, I'm going to be genuine. My old Eastern European cultural heritage makes me a certain way in life, very practical, very direct. I don't beat around the bush, if you will, when saying things like, well, why'd you do that?
Totally.
Say that was dumb, but trying to get that understanding, right?
And I'm guessing that part of the reason is, I would have to imagine that comedians on average have the best BS detectors on the planet.
It's a good point. They probably do. Yeah, I haven't thought about that either. You've brought up a few really interesting points.
Oh my gosh, I'm honored, Ildiko. Thank you. Well, let me ask you a final and a miracle-based question. And that is, based on your work with comedians, and you can even infuse your experiences as a cancer survivor if you wish, if you had the magical powers to confer upon all humanity one skill or insight that would improve the lives of the person or perhaps society, what would that skill or insight be? And what would the impact, do you think, be on the individual and perhaps even society at large? Big question.
The skill that I would impart if I could make
if you could
my therapy wand.
Galinda the Good Witch.
There you go. It's problem solving ability. Like learn to problem solve. Learn to problem solve. I think in a lot of, I don't know if this is your experience and your practice, but what I've been seeing a lot is this difficulty with problem solving. It's not even this ability to take one step in front of the other, but we'll figure it out. Try it this way. That way might not work. Okay, great. Try and see if it does. If it doesn't, try this way. Try that way. Keep trying. And if you get stuck trying, let's figure it out. Maybe I have some idea on what direction might work. That's the big thing. Problem solve.
So many reasons I love this. It reminds me of two things. First of all, it reminds me of Jerry Seinfeld looking at a cereal box, seeing it differently from the way you and I would see it. He would notice something about the cereal box that us muggles would not exactly necessarily notice, and he'd make it funny. And that's really speaking to cognitive flexibility, much like a comedian or somebody who engages in puzzles. You were looking at almost like a comedian / puzzler. Like, right, well, let's try it again. Let's problem solve this way. Well, let's try it that way. And if there's anything you and I are trying to help people get more of, it would be cognitive flexibility. I love that answer. Ildiko, it has been a total pleasure hanging with you and getting to know your work. And I'm so grateful for you being a healer to other healers in the form of comedy.
Oh, that makes me feel so good. Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. And I really appreciate you making me think and answering questions. So thank you.
Right on. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.